It was the sort of July afternoon St. Mary Mead did so well. Blue skies so pure they might have been scrubbed, gardens displaying their roses with an air of vanity, the green, clipped lawn of the vicarage transformed into a bustle of stalls, bunting, and village pride. The annual summer fete had arrived, and with it came that peculiar blend of competitive cheer and undercurrents of quiet rivalry that seemed as essential to the event as the tea and sponge cakes. Under the striped canopy near the refreshment table, Mrs. Partridge presided with a sense of imperial authority. The tea service gleamed, porcelain cups, delicate saucers, and the centerpiece of the afternoon's amusement, a parlor game called the Game of the Three Teacups. It was meant to be harmless fun, the sort of thing to fill a lull between the raffle and the flower show judging. Guests would be blindfolded and presented with 3 cups, each containing a different brew, and they would try to identify them by taste alone. The idea, suggested by young Mrs. Celia Harwood, had been met with an indulgent chuckle from most, though Mrs. Partridge had pursed her lips. "Tea," she had said gravely, "is not a thing to be trifled with." Still, she had agreed to oversee the game. Perhaps the hint of competition appealed to her. After all, St. Mary Mead's genteel contests often had sharper edges than outsiders imagined. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table just within earshot, her knitting needles clicking softly. She was ostensibly there to rest her legs after walking in the charity bric-a-brac auction, but in truth, she had found this vantage point agreeable. From here, she could watch the way Mrs. Partridge frowned whenever Mrs. Harwood laughed too loudly, and how Mrs. Harwood's husband lingered near the pretty school teacher from Much Benham. Such small observations, to her, were as revealing as an open ledger. The game began innocently enough. Reverend Leonard's wife made a comical face after mistaking Assam for Darjeeling. Mr. Giles, the postmaster, took a sip of the lapsang and theatrically declared it like drinking a burnt letter. There was laughter, the kind that carried a faint trace of mockery in the village way. And then, when it came to Mrs. Harwood's turn, there was the faintest pause before she began. She sipped the first cup, smiling. The second, she laughed outright, guessing it correctly. But with the third, her expression altered. A slight furrow formed between her brows. "Goodness, what an odd taste," she said, almost playfully. "Bitter, like—" And then she stopped speaking, the sentence unfinished. Her hand slackened. The porcelain cup tilted. It was Miss Marple who noticed first, not the collapse, but the subtle shift in Mrs. Harwood's complexion, the unnatural pallor that came in waves. When the younger woman's knees buckled, it was Miss Marple who was already rising, steadying her chair before anyone else registered the seriousness of what was happening. Gasps cut through the festive murmur. Someone called for Doctor Haydock. Mrs. Partridge stood frozen, her hand still clutching the tea towel as though it were a standard in battle. The vicar shouted for water, though Miss Marple, her eyes narrowing, murmured, "I rather think that will not help." The fete dissolved into commotion. Children were hurried away, the bunting fluttered in the sudden emptiness, and the air carried a new note, something tighter, charged with dread. Dr. Haydock arrived at a brisk trot, his black bag in hand, his face tightening when he saw the figure now lying still on the grass. There were questions, urgent, overlapping, without clear answers. What was in the cup? Who had poured it? Mrs. Partridge said she had, but that she'd poured from the same pot for everyone. Several guests claimed they had drunk from it without issue. The teacups, still on the table, seemed suddenly sinister in their innocent floral patterns. Miss Marple did not speak further, but her gaze lingered not on the cups themselves, but on the movement around them, the way Mr. Harwood stood too rigidly near his wife's prone form, his hands clasped so tightly they had gone white, the fleeting glance between Mrs. Partridge and the school teacher, as though each feared the other might speak, and the oddly slow, deliberate way the village constable made his notes, as if already deciding what ought to be written before the words were committed. by the time the doctor straightened and announced quietly that Mrs. Harwood was beyond help, the summer fete had shifted from a light-hearted tradition to something far darker. The game of the 3 teacups, conceived as a quaint diversion, had ended as the day's grim headline. Miss Marple resumed her seat, her knitting untouched. Her eyes moved between the teacups, the tea urn, and the people whose day had just been rewritten. She had seen enough to know that this was no accident. Tea might not be a thing to trifle with, but neither was murder. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had exchanged its bunting and fête-day chair for hushed voices and speculative glances. The news of Mrs. Celia Harwood's sudden death had travelled with astonishing speed, slipping from one doorstep to the next, carried in the tones of those who relished being first with the latest detail. The vicarage lawn, so festive only yesterday, now seemed strangely subdued, as though the roses themselves were leaning in to overhear the gossip. Miss Marple, for her part, did not take part in the breathless retellings, though she heard enough without asking. She had spent the morning in her garden, dead-heading her geraniums with the same quiet focus she had used to listen to the conversations at the fete. Yet each snip of her scissors seemed to punctuate her thoughts about the previous day. The look on Mrs. Harwood's face, the way her hand had loosened on the cup, and, most curious of all, the subtle shifts among the onlookers before the doctor pronounced her gone. By 11 o'clock, a light knock at her gate announced Mrs. Price Ridley, who entered without waiting for permission, as was her habit. She was already brimming with what she called the very latest, from an unimpeachable source. "It was poison," she whispered, though the lane was empty. "Dr. Haydock says so. Not that he's saying it to everyone, mind you, but my cousin-in-law's niece's husband works with the surgery accounts, and he heard it directly from the doctor's assistant. A bitter taste in the tea, they said. Something foreign." Miss Marple made a mild sound of acknowledgement, offering her visitor a seat on the bench. "So unfortunate," she murmured. "One thinks of tea as a comfort, not a danger." "Unfortunate, yes," Mrs. Price Ridley agreed, her eyes bright with unspoken theories. "But really, Jane, what sort of woman dies at a village fete? It's too public. And Mrs. Partridge, well, I am not one to spread malicious talk, but she did pour the tea." Miss Marple let the pause hang in the air just long enough to suggest she was considering it, though in truth she was weighing something else entirely. "Mrs. Partridge has poured tea at every fete for the last 12 years without incident," she said mildly. "Still, these are difficult times. One wonders what might have been in the minds of those gathered yesterday." As if summoned by the very mention of the day, the sound of measured footsteps approached along the lane. It was Inspector Crail from Much Benham, a tall man with a weathered face and an air of having seen too many petty quarrels escalate into real trouble. He greeted both ladies politely, but without wasting words. "Miss Marple," he said after a moment's thought, "you were present when Mrs. Harwood collapsed?" "Yes," she replied simply, her gaze steady. "And you noticed nothing unusual in the moments before?" Miss Marple hesitated just enough for the inspector to notice. Nothing that could not be explained by the heat, the press of the crowd, and perhaps a certain tension among some of those present. It is curious, though, how certain expressions flicker and are gone before one quite catches them. Inspector Crail gave her a searching look, but pressed no further. "We've taken the teacups, the pot, and the remaining leaves for testing. The doctor's certain it wasn't natural causes. I'll be speaking to everyone who attended." His eyes shifted to Mrs. Price Ridley. "No doubt you'll know where to find them." By the afternoon, the village's daily rhythm had been entirely rearranged. The post office saw more visitors than usual, each pretending to need stamps while fishing for fresh morsels of information. The grocer was asked repeatedly whether Mrs. Harwood had been in to buy anything unusual in recent days. Even the churchyard saw more foot traffic, for people claimed the path through it was shorter to wherever they were going. Miss Marple walked through it all with her usual quiet composure, but her mind was sifting more than flowers and pleasantries. She recalled the way Mr. Harwood's gaze had fixed, not on his wife, but on the tea table, as though it held something he dreaded. She thought of the small flinch Mrs. Partridge had given when the schoolteacher, Miss Felton, had stepped closer during the commotion. And then there was the constable, young Peters, who had taken such pains to note down statements, though his pen had barely scratched the page. Late in the day, Miss Marple found herself in the village shop, ostensibly to purchase a jar of honey, though she knew it would bring her within range of Mrs. Harris, the shopkeeper, whose quiet manner belied an encyclopedic knowledge of local comings and goings. "Such a shock," Mrs. Harris said at once, weighing out the honey. "She was in here not 3 days ago, Mrs. Harwood was. Bought lemon biscuits and asked for a tin of anchovies. Imagine that. Said it was for a recipe from a magazine. I said to her, 'You won't find many here that go for anchovies, Mrs. Harwood,' and she only laughed." "Anchovies?" Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, as though the idea were merely an eccentric culinary choice. Inwardly, she filed it away. People often overlooked the oddities they grew used to, but Miss Marple had learned that the oddities were often the key. When she returned home, she found a note pushed under her door. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, and unsigned. She was not meant to die. "Meet me at the west end of the churchyard wall after sunset." Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into her knitting bag. She did not rush to conclusions. One could not be certain whether the note was a genuine appeal, an attempt to mislead, or even a cruel jest. Still, it added a new layer to the already troubling picture. As evening fell, the village seemed to hold its breath. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual, the lamps inside casting soft yellow glows against the gathering dark. Miss Marple sat by her window for a while, the note on the small table beside her, listening to the faint sound of the church bell marking the hour. She knew that the person who had written it, whatever their purpose, had chosen their meeting place with care. The west end of the churchyard wall was shaded, half hidden from the lane, and well out of sight from most houses. At last she rose, put on her coat, and took up her walking stick. It would not do to be late. The night air was cool, the scent of honeysuckle lingering, but beneath it was another scent, something sharper, like the first edge of rain before a storm. As she walked, her thoughts moved in quiet, orderly rows, like stitches on her needles. The tea, the expressions, the anchovies, the note. What she did not yet know was how soon those rows would begin to unravel. The west end of the churchyard wall was cloaked in a gentle darkness, the last of the evening light lingering only in the upper branches of the yew trees. St. Mary Mead slept lightly at such an hour. Doors locked, fires banked low. Yet the air held that subtle thrum of watchfulness that comes when a village is newly unsettled. Miss Marple arrived a few minutes early, not from eagerness, but from habit. She believed it better to observe a place before the meeting for which it was intended. Thus she noted the patch of moonlight falling across the lichen-covered stones, the scent of damp earth rising from where the grass met the wall, and the faint rustle of a hedgehog somewhere among the grave. The church clock tolled the quarter hour before she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. A figure emerged from the shadows, hesitating just beyond the moonlight. It was Miss Felton, the young schoolteacher, her usual brisk manner replaced by a furtive nervousness. "Thank you for coming," Miss Felton whispered, glancing about as though the carved angels might be eavesdropping. "I wasn't sure if you would." "One mustn't ignore a note of such urgency," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "You wrote that Mrs. Harwood was not meant to die." Miss Felton clasped her hands together, the movement betraying a tremor. "I don't know everything, only that it was supposed to be a warning, not—" She faltered, swallowing hard. "Not murder. Someone meant to make her ill, to frighten her. But the dose was wrong, too strong. Why frighten her at all?" Miss Felton's eyes darted toward the churchyard gate. "Because she was going to tell me. I think she had found something out. About someone here in the village. and they wanted to stop her before she could speak. The teacher's voice was low, but each word carried weight. Miss Marple, watching her closely, noted the slight pause before someone, and the way her gaze had slid away at the mention of the village. "You think you know who this someone might be?" Miss Felton bit her lip, then shook her head quickly. "No, only that Mrs. Harwood seemed frightened lately. She kept looking over her shoulder in the street, and last week after school I saw her talking to Mr. Harwood near the post office. It was not a pleasant conversation. He looked angry." The wind shifted, carrying the faint chime of the lich gate as it moved in the breeze. Miss Marple drew her coat a little closer, not from the chill but from the awareness that shadows could conceal more than one listener. "And you chose to tell me?" Miss Marple said. "Because you notice things," Miss Felton replied simply. "And because the police, they might think I'm making it up, or worse, that I had something to do with it." She hesitated, then added, "Please don't tell them I wrote to you." "Not yet." Miss Marple inclined her head in agreement, though in her mind she knew that secrecy often had its own dangers. Still, there was a certain advantage in letting information come to her in quiet, unforced drops rather than under official interrogation. They parted without further words, Miss Felton hurrying away along the path, her figure swallowed quickly by the shadows between the yews. Miss Marple lingered for a moment longer, listening to the receding footsteps, before turning toward home. The next morning brought a shift in the village mood. Inspector Crail had begun his rounds, and his questions, delivered with a patient persistence, were drawing sharper edges around the day of the fete. Word spread that the teapot itself had been found to contain traces of a toxic alkaloid, a substance not commonly found in household kitchens. Those with gardens began quietly considering whether their plants might be subject to suspicion. At the post office, Miss Marple overheard Mrs. Price Ridley informing Mrs. Harris that the Harwoods had not been as happily married as they appeared. She was too free with her smiles, Mrs. Price Ridley declared, and he was too easily offended. That sort of combination never lasts. Meanwhile, in the High Street, Mr. Giles, the postmaster, was telling anyone who would listen that he had seen Mrs. Harwood speaking in hushed tones with Mrs. Partridge on the very morning of the fete. "Looked serious, too," he added, with the relish of one contributing something solid to the growing heap of conjecture. Miss Marple, strolling with her basket, took in these reports without comment. It was not in her nature to leap from gossip to conclusion. Rather, she let each piece settle, turning them about in her mind like small polished stones. In the afternoon she paid a call on Dr. Haydock under the pretext of delivering a jar of her quince jelly. The doctor, though fond of Miss Marple, was wary of her conversational skill, which had a way of extracting facts he had not intended to share. "I hear," she said casually as he accepted the jar, "that the tea contained something unpleasant." "More than unpleasant," he replied grimly. "It was aconitine, aconite poisoning to be precise. Deadly stuff. You'd have to go out of your way to find it. From monkshood, is it not?" "Such a lovely plant," Miss Marple observed. "But I suppose one would have to be quite determined to make use of it in this fashion." The doctor eyed her. "You wouldn't happen to have noticed anything unusual yesterday, would you?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. "One notices many things in a village, doctor, but it is often wiser to keep them in the right order, like the steps in a knitting pattern, before attempting to join them together." She left shortly after, her mind turning over the mention of aconitine. Monkshood did grow in a few village gardens, decorative, hardy, and, to the untrained eye, perfectly innocent. But who in St. Mary Mead would know enough to prepare it for such a purpose? As evening drew in, a faint drizzle began to fall, dampening the High Street and lending the shop windows a blurred glow. Miss Marple, returning from her walk, paused at the corner where the lane curved toward the Harwoods' cottage. The curtains were drawn, but a shadow moved briefly across the lighted window. Mr. Harwood, pacing perhaps, or keeping watch for someone. It occurred to her then that fear was not an exclusive property of the innocent. Sometimes the guilty feared more keenly, for they knew precisely what might come to light. And in St. Mary Mead, where nothing stayed hidden forever, that fear could be as revealing as any confession. She continued home, the drizzle tapping lightly on her umbrella, aware that the pattern was beginning to take shape. Only a few stitches had been placed so far, but the picture, when it came, would show not merely who had placed the poison in the teacup, but why the game had been played at all. The drizzle had cleared by morning, leaving St. Mary Mead washed in a soft, pearly light. The air carried the faint scent of damp stone and new grass, and though outwardly the village seemed to have resumed its ordinary business, a keener ear could hear the undercurrent. Questions whispered in shops, pauses when certain names were mentioned, and a quiet sifting of allegiances. Miss Marple, stirring a small pot of porridge at her kitchen stove, reflected that murder had a curious effect on a village. It made people both more guarded and more reckless. Guarded in what they said, reckless in the conclusions they drew. Those conclusions, more often than not, told her more about the person voicing them than about the crime itself. Her first visitor of the day was not entirely unexpected. Mrs. Partridge appeared at the garden gate just after 10, clutching a small basket of scones. She was dressed more formally than the occasion required. Navy coat, hat pinned with precision, and her face wore the kind of set composure that suggested she had rehearsed what she intended to say. "I thought you might like some of these, Miss Marple," she said, stepping inside when invited. "Fresh this morning. My sister always says, a good scone can settle the mind." "A very kind thought," Miss Marple replied, placing them on the table. She poured tea, noting how Mrs. Partridge's hands remained tightly folded in her lap. "I do hope," Mrs. Partridge began after a moment, "that people are not drawing the wrong conclusions. About me, I mean, because I happen to be pouring the tea." "It is natural," Miss Marple said mildly, "for people to look first to the person nearest the act, though proximity is not the same as guilt." Mrs. Partridge exhaled, as though relieved to hear the words aloud. "I should think not. I poured from the same pot for all the contestants, and I drank a cup myself later after the game." She paused, lowering her voice. "It is my belief, Miss Marple, that the poison was in the cup, not the pot." Miss Marple tilted her head, inviting her to continue. "You saw the cups, didn't you? 3 of them for the game, each with its own saucer. I'd arranged them myself, my grandmother's set. After Mrs. Harwood collapsed, I noticed one was missing. It was returned later, but not where I'd placed it." "That is interesting," Miss Marple said. And it was. In her mind she saw again the table at the fete, the floral cups in a neat row. A switched cup might indeed avoid poisoning others while directing it toward a single person. When Mrs. Partridge left, looking marginally comforted, Miss Marple sat quietly for a few minutes, considering. The notion of the cup being the carrier, rather than the pot, added a different thread to the pattern she was knitting in her mind. Her afternoon was spent making small, seemingly aimless calls. At the post office, she asked for a penny stamp and listened as Mr. Giles lamented the inspector's questions, claiming they were more like a Spanish Inquisition than a police inquiry. At the grocer's, she purchased a small bag of sugar and overheard Mrs. Harris telling the young delivery boy that Mr. Harwood had been seen late at night in Much Benham on more than one occasion. Miss Marple's final call was to the school, where she found Miss Felton correcting exercise books in the staff room. The teacher looked up sharply, perhaps wondering whether their meeting in the churchyard had been observed. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Miss Marple said in her gentle way, "that Mrs. Harwood seemed afraid." Miss Felton nodded, glancing at the closed door before speaking. "She was. She hinted to me that she knew something that could ruin someone. She didn't say who. I thought she might be talking about, well, a matter of the heart. But now—" She trailed off, her expression troubled. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the shelf behind the teacher, where a small vase of flowers stood, purple monkshood among the daisies. "Aconitum," she remarked softly. "Oh, those," Miss Felton said, following her gaze. "Mr. Harwood brought them in last week for the classroom. Said they were from his garden." It was a perfectly innocent statement, but it added another stitch to Miss Marple's growing fabric of deduction. She took her leave soon after, walking back through the high street where the shop windows glowed with late afternoon light. Outside the bakery, Mrs. Price Ridley was deep in conversation with Mrs. Bartlett, the church organist. "I've heard," Mrs. Price Ridley was saying, "that Mrs. Harwood had money of her own. A little inheritance from an aunt. I dare say that would tempt some." Mrs. Bartlett pursed her lips. "Money is one thing, but shame is quite another. If she meant to expose someone, they might not care what it cost to stop her." Miss Marple walked past without slowing, but her mind lingered on the words. Shame was indeed a powerful motive, and often a swifter spur to action than greed. That evening, as she sat in her parlor with her knitting, she reflected on the day's gleanings. The possibility of the poisoned cup, the monkshood in Mr. Harwood's garden, the talk of inheritance and scandal, and the quiet fear in Miss Felton's eyes. The inspector was moving in his own way, of course, gathering statements and following whatever evidence the laboratory provided. But Miss Marple knew that in crimes such as these, the truth rarely lay in the tangible alone. It was hidden in the folds of human behavior, in the inconsistencies between what was said and what was done. Her needles clicked softly, steady as her thoughts. The game of the 3 teacups had been presented as harmless amusement, yet it had been chosen for a reason. Whether that reason was convenience, symbolism, or both, she could not yet say. But she felt certain it was no accident, and she also felt certain that, before long, someone in St. Mary Mead would speak a little too freely, revealing more than they intended. All she needed to do was wait and listen. The following day dawned crisp and clear, as though the village had been washed clean overnight. But in St. Mary Mead, clarity of weather rarely translated into clarity of conscience. Behind the gleaming windows and freshly swept doorsteps, speculation was fermenting. The longer the inspector took to make an arrest, the more freely the theories flowed, each villager convinced they had spotted the crucial sign others had missed. Miss Marple had no intention of dissuading them. Loose tongues, after all, often tied their own knots. After breakfast, she walked to the high street under the pretense of collecting a parcel from the post office. In truth, she was curious to see who might be out and about. She passed Mrs. Bartlett near the church, who was returning from the vicarage with a sheet of hymn selections clutched to her chest. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Bartlett said, lowering her voice. "I hear the inspector's taken an interest in Mr. Harwood's finances. Seems his wife's little inheritance was dwindling faster than expected." Miss Marple's expression was one of mild surprise, though she tucked the information neatly into her mental ledger. Money troubles often wore the mask of domestic disagreement until something sharper split them open. At the post office, Mr. Giles handed her the parcel and leaned forward conspiratorially. "You didn't hear this from me, but I saw Mrs. Partridge with Mrs. Harwood 2 days before the fete, and Mrs. Partridge was crying. Not the sort of woman to cry easily, mind you." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped outside, reflecting on how quickly a single observation became, in the telling, a clue. If Mrs. Partridge had indeed been in tears, the reason might be anything from a personal loss to a quarrel over nothing more sinister than sponge cake recipes. Yet in a murder inquiry, the ordinary often took on a sinister shape. Her next stop was the grocer's, where Mrs. Harris was measuring out tea for a customer. "A fine Ceylon blend," she told the man, "though I dare say tea is getting a bad name in this village at the moment." She looked over at Miss Marple and shook her head. "Imagine a fete turning into that." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. Though I have been thinking, whoever placed the poison must have had more than an opportunity. They must have been sure that the cup would reach Mrs. Harwood." Mrs. Harris frowned. "You mean it wasn't in the pot at all?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One never likes to assume." She paid for her purchase and left, knowing that the seed of that thought would now travel faster than she could walk. By mid-afternoon, she found herself at the gate of the Harwoods' cottage. She had not intended to visit, but Mr. Harwood himself appeared, holding the latch as though debating whether to go into the lane or retreat inside. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "if you've come to ask questions—" "I have not," she interrupted gently. "I came to offer my condolences. Your wife was a bright spirit, and her loss is felt by many." The words softened his manner, if only slightly. He invited her into the small parlor, where the air still held the faint trace of the floral scent Mrs. Harwood had favored. A half-finished knitting project lay on the arm of a chair, its bright wool in sharp contrast to the room's gloom. She was fond of village events, Mr. Harwood said, sitting heavily. Always getting involved. Too involved, if you ask me. She liked to poke her nose into things that weren't her concern. "That can be dangerous," Miss Marple murmured. "Though sometimes people are drawn to troubles not of their own making." He looked at her sharply, as though suspecting an insinuation, but then his gaze dropped to the carpet. "The police keep asking about our marriage. We had disagreements, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary. People quarrel. It doesn't mean—" He broke off, his jaw tightening. "Anyway, if someone poisoned her, it wasn't me." Miss Marple let the statement hang in the air, noting that it had been offered without prompting. In her experience, such denials often revealed more about a person's state of mind than they intended. As she took her leave, she noticed a patch of earth by the garden wall where the soil had recently been disturbed. It was small, perhaps the size of a flower pot, and the ground was still faintly moist despite the previous day's rain. Monkshood grew not far from it, its purple spires nodding gently in the breeze. She did not pause to examine them closely. Sometimes it was best not to show too much interest too soon. On her way home, she met Inspector Crail walking toward the Harwood cottage. He gave her a polite nod. "Collecting your own evidence, Miss Marple." "Merely paying respects," she replied. "I leave the official business to those entrusted with it." He smiled faintly. "And yet you seem to know a good deal about the unofficial business." Miss Marple inclined her head. "One learns a great deal by listening, Inspector, particularly when people think they are merely talking." That evening, as the lamps were lit across the village, she sat with her knitting and thought over the threads she had gathered. Mr. Harwood's defensiveness, Mrs. Partridge's talk of a missing cup, the monkshood in the schoolroom and in the Harwood garden, and Miss Felton's claim that the death had been intended as a warning, not a final act. The picture was far from complete, but certain shapes were beginning to emerge. Someone had feared exposure. Someone had chosen the setting of the fete with care, knowing the bustle would conceal a small act with deadly consequence. She suspected that the motive, when it came to light, would be as old as the village itself, rooted in pride, resentment, and the quiet battles fought behind polite smiles. And until then, she would keep her place in the background, an elderly lady with her knitting, watching as the truth slowly unspooled. The following morning found Miss Marple tending to her front borders, trimming the unruly lavender with small, precise snips. The rhythmic work left her mind free to wander over the fragments she had gathered, fragments that, while seemingly unconnected, had begun to take on the faint outline of something coherent. Not a full picture, but the shape of a lie, thinly veiled. It was just before 11 when young Constable Peters appeared at her garden gate, his cap in hand and his manner faintly awkward. "Miss Marple," he began, "the inspector asked me to drop this by." He held out a folded sheet, an invitation of sorts. Inspector Crail was arranging a meeting in the reading room at the village hall later that day, ostensibly to update concerned citizens on the investigation. "How very obliging of the inspector," Miss Marple said, accepting the paper. She wondered how much updating would actually occur, and how much was meant to stir the pot of gossip until something useful floated to the surface. By mid-afternoon, the reading room was nearly full. The faint scent of old books and beeswax polish mingled with the sharper tang of anticipation. Villagers sat in neat rows, some leaning forward, others crossing their arms defensively. Mrs. Partridge was present, sitting stiffly in the front, while Mr. Harwood occupied a chair near the back, his gaze fixed somewhere over the inspector's head. Miss Felton arrived late, slipping into a side seat with the self-consciousness of one who feared she might already be under suspicion. Inspector Crail, standing at the front, cleared his throat. "I won't keep you long. We're continuing to examine the physical evidence. Tests confirm that Mrs. Harwood's tea contained aconitine, highly toxic. Whether it came from the pot or the cup is still under consideration." His gaze swept the room briefly before he added, "Someone here knows how it got there, and I advise them to speak sooner rather than later." A ripple went through the listeners. Miss Marple noted who glanced at whom. Mrs. Bartlett's eyes slid toward Mrs. Partridge. Mrs. Partridge stared resolutely ahead. Mr. Giles, the postmaster, shifted in his seat as though regretting his decision to attend. When the meeting concluded, small knots of conversation formed instantly. Miss Marple allowed herself to be drawn into one near the back, where Mrs. Price Ridley was holding forth. "Mark my words, it was about that inheritance," she declared. "And who would stand to gain the most? Her husband, of course." "Not necessarily," said Mr. Giles, his tone defensive for reasons Miss Marple filed away for later. "Sometimes people kill for reasons that have nothing to do with money." Miss Marple made a mild observation about the unfortunate ease with which rumors multiplied, then slipped away, her curiosity piqued by Mr. Giles's tone. It was a shade too quick, too insistent, as though pushing attention elsewhere. The next day brought an unexpected development. A small parcel arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, left anonymously on her doorstep. Inside was a single teacup, delicate porcelain, pale pink with a faded gilt rim. She recognized it instantly as one from the set Mrs. Partridge had used for the fete. Wrapped around the handle was a slip of paper bearing 3 words. It wasn't me. She examined the cup closely. A faint ring of dried residue clung to the inside, too discolored to be ordinary tea. Whether it was aconitine or something harmless, she could not tell without proper testing, but the message was clear enough. Someone wanted her to believe Mrs. Partridge had been framed. Rather than rush to the inspector, Miss Marple set the cup carefully on a shelf and went about her morning as usual. She stopped by the grocer's, where Mrs. Harris was in an unusually talkative mood. "Between you and me," Mrs. Harris said, lowering her voice, "I heard Miss Felton had words with Mrs. Harwood the day before the fete, right outside the school gates." "What sort of words?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Oh, nothing I could repeat exactly, only that Miss Felton seemed distressed, and Mrs. Harwood walked away, looking rather pleased with herself." By the time Miss Marple reached home, the threads had begun to twist together. Miss Felton's secretive churchyard confession, Mrs. Partridge's insistence about the switched cup, the monk's hood in both the schoolroom and the Harwood garden, and now an anonymously delivered cup, appearing like a silent witness too timid to speak aloud. That evening, as she sat in her parlor with the lamps casting a soft glow over her knitting, Miss Marple considered the careful steps of the murderer. The choice of a public setting, the deliberate narrowing of the poison's reach to a single cup, and the quiet removal of that cup afterward, all suggested someone who understood both risk and opportunity, someone who could move confidently among the fete-goers without attracting notice. She also considered the words Miss Felton had used. It was supposed to be a warning. Such a statement implied knowledge of intent, if not of identity. And intent could shift unexpectedly, especially when emotions were high. A quarrel meant to unsettle could, in the wrong hands, or with the wrong measure of poison, become fatal. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked toward the small shelf where the returned teacup sat in its quiet, damning pinkness. In her mind, she saw again the moment at the fete when Mrs. Harwood had lifted it to her lips, the way her eyes had clouded and the cup tilting just so before slipping from her grasp. The pattern was still incomplete, but the fabric was tightening, and she knew from long experience that once the threads began to pull taut, the entire weave could unravel very quickly indeed. The following morning was bright and brisk, with a low autumn sun throwing long, sharp shadows across the lane. In St. Mary Mead, the clear air seemed only to sharpen the appetite for speculation. Curtains twitched more often than doors opened, and conversations were carried out in the privacy of front parlours rather than in the open air. Miss Marple, stepping out to fetch a small bundle of laundry from Mrs. Wheeler's, noted how quickly the village had rearranged itself into a network of closed rooms and lowered voices. It was an instinct she understood well. When danger prowled close to home, people drew in, speaking only where they felt unseen. She had just reached the corner by the church when she spotted Mrs. Partridge emerging from the vicarage gate. The woman's usual brisk composure was absent, replaced by a pinched, anxious look. She caught sight of Miss Marple and hesitated, as though weighing whether to approach. "Miss Marple," she said finally, "might I have a word? Somewhere private?" They walked together to the quieter side path that skirted the churchyard. Mrs. Partridge kept her voice low. "I didn't send that cup to you, I swear it. I've no idea who did, but it wasn't me. If I wanted to convince you I was innocent, I'd tell you to your face." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "Then someone must wish me to believe you are falsely accused. That is rather a different thing from simply clearing you." Mrs. Partridge frowned. "You think it's a trick?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that in matters such as these, one must ask not only who benefits from an act, but who benefits from the appearance of that act." The conversation ended there, but the point lodged firmly in Miss Marple's mind. It was not enough to look at the act itself. One had to consider the ripples it sent outward and whose reputations it lifted or sank. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Miss Felton. The schoolroom smelled faintly of chalk and ink, and the desks gleamed from a recent polishing. Miss Felton was tidying a stack of exercise books, her movements clipped and restless. "I've been thinking about what you told me," Miss Marple began, "and I wonder if you might be persuaded to tell me what sort of thing Mrs. Harwood threatened to reveal." Miss Felton froze for a moment, then set down the books with deliberate care. "It was about an understanding between two people, a private understanding. She wasn't supposed to know, but somehow she did. I believe she meant to use it against one of them." "Was this understanding of a romantic nature?" Miss Felton's color rose slightly. "Yes. And if it came out, it could have damaged more than reputations. It could have cost someone their position." Miss Marple let the silence stretch, knowing the younger woman was weighing how much to say. Eventually, Miss Felton added, "She hinted that she might tell the inspector. She thought it would amuse her, I think, having the power to disrupt things. But I swear I never wanted her harmed." From Miss Felton's tone, Miss Marple believed her. But belief was not proof, and proof was not yet at hand. On her way back through the high street, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Giles, the postmaster, locking up earlier than usual. His face was drawn, his gaze shifting toward the end of the lane where the Harwood cottage stood. She greeted him lightly, but his reply was curt, and he moved on without engaging in his usual small talk. It was a marked change for a man who rarely passed up the chance to exchange a morsel of gossip. That evening brought an unexpected visitor, Inspector Crail himself. He stood in the doorway, tall and solid, his expression a mixture of professional reserve and faint curiosity. "Miss Marple," he said, "I thought you might like to know that we've traced the wrapping paper from that teacup you were given. It came from the post office. used for small parcels. Mr. Giles claims anyone could have taken a sheet from the counter." "How obliging of him," Miss Marple said, with only the faintest emphasis. The inspector's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think he's holding something back?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that withholding is an art often practiced unconsciously. People do not always realize what they omit until someone points it out." He left after a short while, and Miss Marple sat for some time by the fire, considering the intersections. A quarrel involving Mrs. Harwood, a romantic entanglement with the potential to ruin reputations, monkshood from two separate gardens. A postmaster is suddenly less willing to talk, and a cup delivered anonymously, wrapped in paper from his own counter. It was not yet enough to name a culprit, but the threads were drawing tighter, and Miss Marple knew that in such cases, pressure was a more effective tool than direct accusation. If she could bring the right people into conversation, the strain of keeping their stories straight might reveal the crack she needed. She went to bed that night with a plan beginning to form. A small gathering, arranged under the guise of neighborly concern, but designed with the precision of a needle threading through fabric. Somewhere in the polite exchanges and careful half-truths, she would watch for the slip, and when it came, she would be ready. The invitation was worded with the vicar's characteristic charm, though the hand that guided the idea had been Miss Marple's. A quiet tea at the vicarage, to comfort ourselves in troubled times, as Mrs. Clement put it, seemed a most suitable setting. In truth, Miss Marple wanted to see certain people together, people whose glances and silences had been as telling as their words. The gathering was small enough to feel intimate, but not so small as to seem deliberate. Mrs. Partridge arrived first, bringing a jar of homemade damson jam. Miss Felton followed shortly after, clutching a paper bag of shortbread biscuits from the bakery. Mr. Giles, the postmaster, was last, his face polite but wary, as though uncertain why he had agreed to come. The vicarage drawing-room was warm with the scent of polished wood and freshly baked scones. The tea service, Mrs. Clement's treasured Worcester set, was laid out with perfect propriety, and the vicar moved about with genial efficiency, pouring and offering plates. Miss Marple sat quietly near the hearth, her knitting in her lap, her eyes half on her work and half on the interplay among her guests. Mrs. Partridge was seated beside Miss Felton, though they avoided meeting each other's gaze. Mr. Giles took his tea with exaggerated care, stirring it longer than necessary, as if to occupy his hands. Conversation began lightly, remarks on the weather, the coming harvest festival, but the undercurrent was never far. Mrs. Clement, guided by a subtle glance from Miss Marple, brought up the fate. "A dreadful thing, of course," Mrs. Clement said, "to have a tragedy in the midst of such a happy day. But I suppose we must all be grateful for the inspector's diligence." "Yes," Mrs. Partridge replied, her tone a little too firm, though one wonders if he will ever find the real culprit. "That's assuming he hasn't already," Mr. Giles remarked, glancing at her over the rim of his cup. Miss Felton's hand twitched, sending her spoon clinking against the saucer. "I should think," she said quickly, "that we'd all prefer not to speak of it here." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her voice mild. "Ah, but sometimes it's useful to recall details, even in a friendly setting. Memories can be jogged in the most unexpected ways." Mrs. Partridge sighed. "I've said before, I poured from the same pot for everyone. If the poison was in the cup, then it must have been placed there before it reached me." "And yet," Mr. Giles said slowly, "you were the one handling the cups." Miss Marple let the remark settle. She knew that if left too long, such a barb could provoke more than its speaker intended. Mrs. Partridge flushed, her eyes narrowing. "I was not the only one near that table," she said sharply. "Anyone could have switched a cup, anyone who knew which one would be given to Mrs. Harwood." It was then that Miss Marple spoke, her tone no different from before. "The real question, I think, is not merely who could have done it, but who knew it needed to be done at all. Who knew Mrs. Harwood was to be one of the players in the game? The room fell momentarily quiet. The game of the 3 teacups had been an idea suggested by Mrs. Harwood herself, but the list of participants had not been formally announced. Only a few had known in advance who would take part. Miss Felton shifted in her seat. "She mentioned it to me," she said, her voice low. "But I thought it was just a conversation. I didn't realize—" She broke off, her cheeks coloring. Mr. Giles' eyes flicked toward her, quick and calculating. She might have told others too. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Yes, she might. But we must remember that for such a plan to succeed, timing is everything. The cup must be prepared, the moment chosen. That requires more than idle knowledge. It requires anticipation." The conversation drifted on after that, but the mood had shifted. The tea was finished, the scones reduced to crumbs, and one by one the guests made their polite farewells. Mr. Giles was the first to go, followed by Mrs. Partridge, her chin held high, and finally Miss Felton, who left with a murmured thanks. When the door had closed behind the last of them, Mrs. Clement turned to Miss Marple. "You are testing them," she said quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One learns a great deal by placing people together and letting them talk. Did you notice how Mr. Giles was so quick to turn suspicion on Mrs. Partridge, yet avoided speaking of his own proximity to the tea table? And Miss Felton?" "Defensive before she was accused," Miss Marple said. "That often means a guilty conscience, though not necessarily of the thing in question. I suspect she's holding a different piece of the puzzle, one she fears will be misunderstood." As Miss Marple walked home through the fading light, she turned the afternoon's exchanges over in her mind. Certain patterns had begun to sharpen. The teacup itself remained central, passed from hand to hand, and yet somehow prepared for one person only. Whoever had done it had chosen a method that depended on familiarity with the fête's little rituals. She was also certain now that the motive was not simple greed. There was a personal edge to this crime, the sort of sting that came from wounded pride or long-harbored resentment. And the more she thought of it, the more she believed that Mrs. Harwood had, perhaps unknowingly, pushed exactly the right button to bring it about. That evening, as she put her knitting back into its basket, she thought of one more thing: the disturbed patch of earth in the Harwood garden, just by the monk's hood. A small detail, perhaps, but Miss Marple had learned that small details, properly placed, could tip the balance between suspicion and proof. The next day brought with it a soft, windless evening, the kind that seemed to hold the village in a gentle pause before nightfall. St. Mary Mead's lanes were quiet, the cottages lit here and there with the warm glow of oil lamps and the occasional crackle from a hearth. Miss Marple, however, was not at her fireside. She was standing at the end of the Harwood's garden path, her walking stick in one hand and a mild smile prepared for whoever might chance upon her. She had timed her visit for the hour when most people were at supper, knowing it would afford her a degree of privacy. Mr. Harwood had been in his front garden earlier, trimming the hedge, but now the house stood silent save for the faint clink of crockery from inside. The back gate was unlatched, a detail Miss Marple could not imagine being overlooked unless one had grown careless or confident. She followed the narrow path to the side of the house, her steps unhurried. The air smelled faintly of turned soil, mingled with the sweet, almost cloying scent of monkshood blooming along the border. She paused at the bed nearest the garden wall, where she had previously noticed the disturbed patch of earth. It was still there, though more smoothed over now, as if someone had taken the trouble to disguise it. Leaning lightly on her stick, she examined the area without actually bending down. A few leaves were scattered on the soil, carelessly placed, she thought, to suggest natural fall. Underneath, the ground was slightly sunken, as though something had been buried and removed again. Her quiet inspection was interrupted by a voice from the kitchen window. "Miss Marple, what are you doing out there?" It was Mr. Harwood, his tone more wary than welcoming. "Such a lovely evening," she replied pleasantly. "I couldn't resist a stroll, and I thought I'd admire your monk's hood. Quite splendid this year." He came to the back door, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Pretty to look at, but dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes resting on him steadily. "One hears of terrible accidents when people mistake it for harmless herbs. I dare say you've heard of such things yourself." He gave a short laugh, though there was no mirth in it. "I keep mine well away from anything edible." They stood for a moment in a silence that was not entirely comfortable. Miss Marple made a small, polite comment about the weather and then took her leave, but as she walked back toward her cottage, she carried with her the image of his eyes, a flicker too guarded, as though he had weighed every syllable he had spoken. The following morning she visited Mrs. Harris at the grocer's, ostensibly to purchase a tin of condensed milk. Mrs. Harris, who was in the habit of knowing who came and went from every corner of the village, proved informative without much prompting. "Funny thing," Mrs. Harris said as she wrapped the tin, "but I saw Mr. Harwood in much Benham the day before the fete. He was buying a packet of sugar, though I know he gets his from here. Not much in that, I suppose, except he seemed very particular that it was in a paper bag, not a tin or box." Miss Marple accepted the parcel with a smile. "People have their habits," she murmured. "Sometimes they are quite telling." She left the shop deep in thought. Sugar could, of course, be nothing more than sugar, but she had heard enough tales in her time to know that powdered substances could be hidden in such a form. A small quantity of aconitine, properly disguised, might easily pass without suspicion until stirred into a particular cup. That afternoon, Miss Marple's plan took her to the post office. Mr. Giles was behind the counter, sorting letters with his usual briskness, but she noticed his hands slowed when she greeted him. "I've been meaning to ask," she said in a conversational tone, "how busy you were on the morning of the fete." "Busy enough," he replied. "Half the village seemed to be sending parcels to their relatives." "Ah, parcels," Miss Marple said softly, "and wrapping paper in steady use, no doubt." Mr. Giles gave a quick nod, then looked away, reaching for a pile of envelopes. "That's right." It was not much, but his reluctance to meet her eyes spoke louder than the words themselves. She left with nothing more than a smile and a stamp, but her conviction was strengthening. By early evening, she had pieced together a quiet chain of actions. Mrs. Harwood's knowledge of a private affair, the likelihood that she had been intended for a warning, not a killing, the choice of the game of the 3 teacups as the perfect public cover, the shifting of a cup carefully prepared. And somewhere in that sequence lay the reason why someone had gone to the trouble of returning the cup to her doorstep, cloaked in anonymity. After supper, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and penned a short note to Inspector Crail. She did not name a suspect yet, but she asked that he call on her the following day. "There are certain matters," she wrote, "which may be better considered before they have a chance to vanish entirely from sight." Folding the note neatly, she placed it on the hall table for the morning post. Outside, the village had settled into its nighttime hush, the air cool and still. She thought again of the disturbed patch of earth in the Harwood garden and of the way Mr. Harwood's eyes had flickered when she spoke of accidents. It was not proof, not yet. But the shape of the lie she had glimpsed earlier was becoming clearer, and she suspected that very soon the person who had woven it would begin to feel the threads tighten. Inspector Crail arrived at Miss Marple's cottage promptly at 10:30, the sound of his measured knock carrying through the quiet lane. When she opened the door, his tall frame filled the threshold, and the autumn light caught the faint lines of curiosity etched at the corners of his eyes. "You said you had matters to discuss," he began, stepping inside when she motioned him toward the parlor. "Given the way you phrased your note, I'd say you've noticed something you believe I've overlooked." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "Not overlooked, Inspector. Merely not yet linked together. Sometimes connections are easier to see from a little distance." He took a seat opposite her while she poured tea, her movements unhurried. "You've been making your rounds, haven't you?" he said. "Mrs. Partridge, Miss Felton, Mr. Giles, even Mr. Harwood himself." "One hears things," Miss Marple replied, handing him a cup. "And one notices more than one hears. For example, you are no doubt aware of the disturbed soil in the Harwood garden." The inspector's brows rose. "We saw it. Could be anything. A plant moved, a root dug out." "Yes, indeed. Or it could be where something was hidden. Monkshood in its processed form is easier to conceal than one might think, and the soil has been smoothed over twice, once before Mrs. Harwood's death and once after." Inspector Crail regarded her steadily. "And you think it's connected to the aconitine in the tea?" "I think it very likely that someone harvested more than blooms from that garden," Miss Marple said. "But what interests me most is not the plant itself, but the chain of actions surrounding the cup." Crail leaned back slightly. "Go on." "The poison was in the cup, not the pot." "Mrs. Partridge is correct about that, which means it had to be prepared in advance and placed where it would be certain to reach Mrs. Harwood. That required two things: knowing she would play the game and knowing which cup would be hers." "And you think only a few people knew that?" Miss Marple nodded. "Fewer than one might imagine. Mrs. Harwood herself, of course, Mrs. Partridge, who arranged the cups, and one or two others to whom Mrs. Harwood might have mentioned it in passing. Miss Felton admits she was told, though she insists she didn't take it seriously. Mr. Giles may well have overheard something while at the post office. He has a way of catching stray remarks. And Mr. Harwood, well, a husband might be expected to know his wife's intentions for the fete." The inspector was silent for a moment, then said, "And the cup that turned up on your doorstep?" "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "That is the most intriguing detail. Whoever returned it did so to create an impression, perhaps to make me believe Mrs. Partridge was framed, or perhaps to deflect suspicion from themselves by appearing helpful. The paper it was wrapped in came from the post office, which does not prove Mr. Giles sent it, but does place him in the line of possibility." Crail frowned. "You're suggesting the cup was moved twice. Once to deliver the poison, once to make a point." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "A dangerous game moving evidence about. It risks drawing attention rather than diverting it." He set his cup down carefully. "You haven't named your suspect outright." "No," she replied, "because I do not yet have the one small piece that will make the pattern undeniable. But I believe that peace will come if the right question is asked in the right company." "And you want me to be the one to ask it?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "You have the authority, Inspector. People answer you because they must. They answer me because they forget I'm there. If we combine those approaches, I believe we may get the truth more quickly." They spoke for a while longer, sketching out the outlines of such a meeting. The inspector, though initially cautious, seemed to warm to the idea. When he left, it was with the promise that he would arrange a small, informal gathering under the guise of clarifying statements. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the high street, stopping here and there to exchange pleasantries. At the grocer's, Mrs. Harris mentioned that she had seen Mr. Giles and Miss Felton in conversation the previous evening outside the school. "It looked like they didn't want to be seen," she added knowingly. At the post office, Mr. Giles was alone. Miss Marple bought a sheet of stamps and made a mild remark about the inspector's meeting. He looked up sharply. "He's holding another one. Didn't he get enough from us the first time?" "Perhaps he hopes for clarity," Miss Marple said. "Sometimes people remember things later." "Well, I've nothing more to say," Mr. Giles muttered, returning to his sorting. That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting idle in her lap. She could feel the threads of the matter drawing tighter. The players were nearly all in place. The missing detail might lie in a single phrase, a passing glance, or a defensive word spoken too quickly. The inspector would have his meeting within 2 days, and Miss Marple intended to be there. Not as a participant, but as an observer, the quiet witness in the corner who saw not only what was said, but also how it was said. For in her experience, truth had a way of slipping out sideways, escaping in moments when people believed they had control of themselves. And in St. Mary Mead, where every smile might mask an old resentment, that moment was never far away. The inspector's clarification meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon in the reading room of the village hall. It was not announced on a public notice board. Only those who had been present at the fête's tea table received the quiet summons. The invitation, delivered by Constable Peters with a certain officious gravity, stated simply that the inspector wished to tie up a few loose ends. Miss Marple arrived early, ostensibly to offer assistance in setting out chairs. The long table at the front bore a jug of water and several neat stacks of paper, though she doubted the inspector would need them. His intention, she suspected, was not to record, but to provoke. One by one, the others arrived. Mrs. Partridge, her posture stiff, settled herself near the front with the air of someone determined not to be intimidated. Miss Felton slipped into a seat near the wall, her eyes lowered but her ears clearly alert. Mr. Giles, the postmaster, took a place in the middle row, his hands clasped tightly on his knees. Finally, Mr. Harwood entered, casting a quick glance around before choosing a seat near the door. Inspector Crail, tall and deliberate, stepped to the front once they were all assembled. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I want to go over the events of the fete one last time. We've established that Mrs. Harwood's tea contained aconitine. We've also established that several of you were near the cups and pot before the game began. What remains is to determine the exact moment when the fatal dose was introduced." He let his gaze travel across them, pausing just long enough on each face to invite discomfort. Mrs. Partridge was the first to speak. "I've told you, Inspector. I poured from the same pot for everyone. If the poison was in the cup, it was placed there before I touched it." Mr. Giles gave a faint snort. "So you say. But you were the one handling the cups. And you were the one with easy access to wrapping paper from the post office?" Mrs. Partridge shot back. "Perhaps you'd like to explain how a cup from my set came to be delivered to Miss Marple, wrapped in your paper." All eyes turned to Mr. Giles. He flushed slightly. "I told you before, anyone could take a sheet. People do it all the time when they're posting something. It doesn't mean I wrapped it." Miss Marple, sitting quietly in the back corner, noted the defensive stiffness in his shoulders. Not the stiffness of indignation, but of someone guarding a deeper truth. Inspector Crail stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Giles, you were near the refreshment table before the game began. Can you tell me exactly why?" The postmaster hesitated. I was helping carry in the trays. Someone asked me to fetch an extra jug of water, that's all." "Who asked you?" the inspector pressed. Giles glanced toward Miss Felton, then looked away. "I don't remember." It was a clumsy evasion, and Miss Marple saw Miss Felton's fingers tighten around the edge of her chair. The inspector allowed the silence to stretch before turning to Miss Felton. "You said earlier that Mrs. Harwood mentioned she was going to play the game. Did you tell anyone else?" Miss Felton's eyes darted to the floor. "I may have. I think I mentioned it to Mr. Giles in passing, but I didn't think it mattered." "Mattered enough for the right person to know which cup to prepare," the inspector said quietly. Mr. Harwood shifted in his seat. "This is ridiculous. You're making it sound as if we were all conspiring to kill her. I had no reason to—" He stopped abruptly, his jaw tightening. "And yet," Inspector Crail said, "you had monkshood growing in your garden. You were seen in Much Benham buying sugar the day before the fete. And there's the matter of the disturbed patch of earth on your border." Mr. Harwood's face flushed. "Monkshood is ornamental. I grow it because it looks fine on the border, and I bought sugar because we'd run out. As for the earth, I was moving a plant." Miss Marple's voice, quiet but clear, carried across the room. Curious, though, that the earth had been disturbed again after the fit. The inspector glanced toward her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Indeed, that's the sort of detail that interests me as well. Mrs. Partridge shifted uncomfortably. All this talk about gardens and sugar. None of it proves who did it. No, Miss Marple agreed. But sometimes proof lies not in what is present, but in what is absent. In this case, the absence of any plausible reason for that cup to have been handled twice, once to prepare it, once to deliver it to my door, suggests that the person responsible for the first act was not the same as the person responsible for the second. A faint murmur ran through the room. Inspector Crail straightened. Which means we may be looking at more than one guilty hand, or at least more than one person who knows the truth. Miss Felton's lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. Mr. Giles avoided her gaze. Mr. Harwood stared at the floor, and Mrs. Partridge folded her arms tightly as if to keep from making any involuntary gesture. The inspector's eyes moved from one to the other. "I suggest," he said slowly, "that those of you who have been withholding information take the night to reconsider, because the next time we meet, I'll be less patient." With that, he dismissed them. Chairs scraped, murmured thanks were given without conviction, and the group dispersed into the pale afternoon light. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, gathering her knitting bag. The inspector joined her at the back of the room. "You were right," he said quietly. "We've rattled them. Something will give." "It usually does," Miss Marple replied. "The trick is to be watching when it happens." As she stepped out into the lane, the crisp air carried with it the faint scent of autumn leaves. Somewhere behind her, doors closed and bolts slid into place. But Miss Marple knew that secrecy, like the season, could not hold forever. Already the fabric was fraying. One small pull, and the whole pattern would come apart. The night after the inspector's meeting was one of those still, watchful evenings in St. Mary Mead, when the very air seemed to be listening. Miss Marple, sitting by her window with her knitting idle in her lap, had the sense that several of her neighbors were lying awake behind drawn curtains, minds busy with calculations and doubts. Consciences, she had learned long ago, could be as restless as a cat in the dark. The next morning brought the first sign that the meeting had unsettled more than it had resolved. Mrs. Clement arrived at Miss Marple's door shortly after breakfast, her cheeks flushed from the cool air. "My dear, I've just seen Miss Felton walking up the lane toward the post office," she said, breathless with the urgency of one delivering important intelligence. She looked positively ill, pale and tight-lipped, and she was carrying a letter. "I rather think she intends to post it." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet interest. "Did she seem in a hurry?" "In a great hurry. She didn't even stop when Mrs. Price Ridley tried to engage her. Just nodded and kept going." After Mrs. Clement had gone, Miss Marple took her coat and set out herself, choosing a route that would bring her past the post office without appearing to make for it directly. When she arrived, the doorway was empty, but inside she found Mr. Giles alone at the counter, sorting through a small stack of envelopes. "Good morning," she said pleasantly, laying down a card to be weighed. "I hear you've had an early customer." He glanced up, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Felton dropped off a letter, yes. Said it was personal." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Personal matters often are the most pressing. One wonders whether they are best put into writing." He did not respond, but she noticed the slight movement of his thumb along the edge of the top envelope, as if ensuring it remained in place. It was a small tell, but it told her enough. The letter was still there. And whatever its contents, it had been written in the anxious hours after the meeting, when thoughts are often less guarded. She left without pressing further, knowing that direct interference might close the opportunity entirely. Instead, she made her way to the grocer's where Mrs. Harris was arranging jars of jam in the front window. Such a strange business, Mrs. Harris said at once. I've been thinking about that tea game. If the poison was in the cup, someone must have brought it to the fete already prepared. But who would dare walk about the village carrying something like that? Someone accustomed to carrying parcels without drawing notice, Miss Marple replied. We have such people here, don't we? Mrs. Harris blinked. Well, there's Mr. Giles, of course, and the delivery lad, and Mrs. Partridge sometimes carries things from her sisters when she visits. The remark was idle enough, but it confirmed something Miss Marple had been mulling. The physical act of transporting the cup required both opportunity and a lack of scrutiny. Not many people could move something so specific without attracting it. That afternoon, she was in her garden trimming the last of the summer roses when Inspector Crail appeared at her gate. Thought you might like an update, he said, leaning on the latch. Miss Felton came in to see me. She says she's been frightened ever since the fete. Claims someone warned her to keep quiet about what Mrs. Harwood told her, or she might regret it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Did she say who? She says she doesn't know. Claims the warning came in an unsigned note pushed under her door 2 nights before the fete. She destroyed it without thinking much of it at the time. Miss Marple considered this. Destroying the note might be a sign of fear, or of convenience. And did she mention what exactly Mrs. Harwood told her? The inspector shook his head. Only that it concerned another person's private affair. She still refuses to give a name, says it's not her secret to tell. Which, Miss Marple said softly, is sometimes another way of saying it is too dangerous to tell. After the inspector left, Miss Marple sat in her parlor and thought about the difference between truth withheld for honor and truth withheld for self-preservation. In her experience, the two often wore the same face, but only one was likely to be found in the company of murder. The following morning, a small event occurred that confirmed her sense that the fabric of secrecy was beginning to tear. Mrs. Price Ridley, always alert to the undercurrents of the village, stopped her outside the church. "My dear, you won't believe what I've just heard," she whispered. "Mr. Harwood was seen speaking to Mr. Giles behind the village hall yesterday evening, not long after your meeting, mind you, and it didn't look like a friendly chat." Miss Marple gave a mild smile. People do have disagreements. Yes, but this looked purposeful, as if they were arranging something they didn't want overheard. The image slid neatly into the arrangement of facts in Miss Marple's mind. The connection between Mr. Harwood and Mr. Giles was one she had suspected, but until now she had lacked a recent confirmation. That evening, she took out the knitting she had been neglecting and worked quietly by the lamplight, the needles clicking softly. The pattern she was following was intricate, with a series of loops and crossings that seemed at first unrelated. But as each row built on the last, the design began to reveal itself, just as the crime was doing in her thoughts. She now believed the truth lay in 2 layers, the initial preparation of the poisoned cup and the later act of returning it anonymously. 2 acts, possibly by 2 different hands, but connected by knowledge of what the cup had carried. Whoever had moved it after the crime had done so with intent, either to shield someone or to manipulate suspicion toward another. The letter Miss Felton had posted, the private conversation between Mr. Harwood and Mr. Giles, the hurried recovering of soil in the Harwood garden, each was a loose stitch, and Miss Marple knew from long practice that when enough loose stitches gathered in one place, the whole garment could come apart with the gentlest tug. It was time, she thought, to arrange for that tug. The inspector's next meeting would not be under the banner of clarification. It would be the moment to lay the final threads on the table and see who tried to snatch them away. 2 days later, the inspector's summons went out. This time it was not phrased as a polite request for clarification. The note, delivered personally by Constable Peters to each door, stated that further questioning was essential to the progress of the investigation and that attendance was expected. The reading room at the village hall was again chosen as the venue, and the hour set for late afternoon, when shadows would already be lengthening across the high street. Miss Marple walked there with her usual unhurried step, her appearance no different from any other social errand. But in her mind, the pieces of the puzzle were aligning, their edges fitting more snugly with each passing day. She was not yet ready to name the culprit, but she was confident the Awa inspector's plan and her own quiet observations would draw the truth into the open. The small group assembled looked more strained than before. Mrs. Partridge had the resolute air of one bracing for an unpleasant duty. Miss Felton sat with her hands folded tightly, her eyes fixed on the table as if determined not to meet anyone's gaze. Mr. Giles was already in his seat, his jaw set, while Mr. Harwood lingered near the doorway, as though contemplating escape. Inspector Crail opened the meeting with a little preamble. "We've been over the events of the fete more than once, but there are still gaps. Gaps that I believe some of you could close if you chose to." He allowed the words to settle before continuing. "We know the poison was in the cup, not the pot. We know it was placed there in advance. What we do not yet know is who had both the opportunity and the motive to do so." He turned first to Mrs. Partridge. "You've said the cups came from your grandmother's set. Did you bring them to the fete yourself?" "Yes," she replied crisply, "wrapped in a cloth in my basket. I set them on the table, arranged them, and poured from the pot when the game began." "And was the basket unattended at any time?" Mrs. Partridge hesitated. "I left it in the refreshment tent while I helped carry in more chairs. Anyone could have gone near it." "Anyone," the inspector repeated. "Or anyone who knew those cups would be used for the game." Mrs. Partridge looked uncomfortable, but said nothing more. Crail shifted his gaze to Miss Felton. "You told us Mrs. Harwood mentioned she would be playing. Who else did you tell?" "I already said, Mr. Giles," she murmured. "I didn't think it mattered." The inspector's attention moved to the postmaster. "And you, Mr. Giles, had access to the refreshment tent that morning?" Giles's hands tightened on his knees. "I was helping set it up, fetching water, carrying trays. I wasn't near the cups long enough to—" "You also," Crail interrupted, "had access to the wrapping paper used to deliver the cup to Miss Marple. Which means, even if you didn't place the poison, you handled the evidence afterwards." Mr. Giles flushed deeply. "I didn't send that cup. I swear it." From her seat in the corner, Miss Marple spoke softly but clearly. "Yet you did meet Mr. Harwood after the first meeting here, behind the village hall where you were seen by Mrs. Price Ridley. That suggests some matter of urgency between you." The inspector's eyes sharpened. "Is that true?" Mr. Giles shifted uncomfortably. "We spoke, yes, but it had nothing to do with the fete." "What was it to do with that, then?" Crail pressed. Giles' mouth opened and closed before he answered. "A private matter." Miss Marple's gaze moved to Mr. Harwood. "And you, sir, did this private matter involve the removal of something from your garden?" For the first time, Harwood looked startled. "What? No, He stopped, realizing too late that the denial had come too quickly, too forcefully. The inspector pounced. "We have reason to believe the monkshood in your garden was disturbed before and after the fete." "Care to explain why?" Harwood's lips tightened. "I was moving a plant, I told you." "Twice in 3 days?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Once before your wife died, and again afterward." A thin silence followed. The air in the room felt heavier, the dust motes hanging motionless in the slanting light from the windows. It was Miss Felton who broke it, her voice low but urgent. "You don't understand. It wasn't meant to kill her. It was just supposed to make her ill, to frighten her. She was threatening to ruin someone who didn't deserve it." "Who?" the inspector demanded. Felton's eyes darted to Mr. Giles, then to Mr. Harwood. "If I say, you'll think the worst, but it wasn't like that." Miss Marple's tone was gentle. "My dear, truth does not grow easier with time, and when it is left unsaid, it tends to be twisted into something worse than it is." Miss Felton's hands trembled in her lap. "She found out about me and about someone else. She said she'd tell the school board, the vicar, everyone. I told Mr. Giles in a panic. I didn't know what else to do, but I swear I never touched that cup." All eyes turned to the postmaster. His face had gone ashen. "I didn't poison her," he said hoarsely, "but I knew Harwood had monkshood in his garden. I may have mentioned it. I didn't think he'd—" "You didn't think he'd take it further," Miss Marple finished for him. "And yet someone did. Someone who not only prepared that cup but saw to it that Mrs. Harwood would be the one to drink from it." The inspector let the words hang. "We are very close," he said at last. "Closer than some of you realize, and when the last piece falls into place, there will be no room left to hide." One by one they left the reading room, their faces pale, their steps hurried. Miss Marple watched them go, her mind quietly fitting their words and silences into the pattern she had been knitting since the day of the fete. She did not yet speak the name aloud, but she felt its weight pressing closer with every beat of the village clock. Soon, she thought. Very soon. The day after the second gathering at the village hall was marked by an uneasy stillness in St. Mary Mead. The usual rhythm of the high street, children running errands, neighbors exchanging news over low hedges, was subdued as though the entire village were holding its breath. Miss Marple, who had witnessed this kind of pause many times before, recognized it for what it was, the moment before something long concealed is forced into the open. She spent the morning in her garden, trimming back the late blooms and tucking away the last of the summer geraniums. All the while, her mind moved between the faces she had seen at the meeting, the guarded glances, the quick denials, the names that had not been spoken but hung in the air nonetheless. She knew from experience that the truth rarely burst forth in a blaze. Rather, it seeped through small cracks, often when a person thought themselves safest. By late morning, she decided to take a walk to the post office. She did not go directly. Detours were always useful, for one might encounter things by seeming accident. Near the vicarage, she met Mrs. Clement, who was hurrying along with a basket of preserves for the church sale. "My dear," Mrs. Clement said in a lowered voice, "the whole village is on edge. Mrs. Partridge has been in and out of the high street twice already today, looking like a woman who's misplaced something important, and Miss Felton hasn't been at the school since yesterday afternoon." Miss Marple's brows lifted slightly. "Not at all. The children were told she was unwell, but I wonder—" Mrs. Clement trailed off, clearly hoping for some insight. Miss Marple offered only a gentle smile. "Illnesses of the mind can be as pressing as those of the body, my dear." At the post office, Mr. Giles was alone behind the counter. His usual brisk manner was muted. He avoided her eyes as she asked for a sheet of paper and a small envelope. While he measured the paper, Miss Marple remarked, almost absently, "One never knows what the next day will bring. Letters, for instance. Sometimes they carry things one has been expecting, and sometimes they bring rather unwelcome surprises." Mr. Giles glanced up sharply, then lowered his gaze again. "True enough," he muttered, and busied himself with the drawer. She thanked him and left, the faint color in his face confirming that the tension of the inspector's questions was still very much with him. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Partridge under the pretense of returning a recipe book. The older woman was visibly flustered, her hands busy with a tea towel that she twisted and untwisted as they spoke. "I suppose you've heard all sorts of things since the meeting," Mrs. Partridge said abruptly. "About that cup. About me." "People will talk," Miss Marple replied mildly. "But talking is not the same as proving. It is a poor foundation for judgment." Mrs. Partridge hesitated, then said, "You know, I've been thinking if someone meant to poison her, why choose the fate? There are easier ways." "Sometimes," Miss Marple said softly. "The setting is part of the point. In a crowd, small things pass unnoticed, and if the act can be made to look like something else, a mishap or a simple turn of health, so much the better." Mrs. Partridge's eyes narrowed. "You think it was planned that way?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that the more carefully something is planned, the more carefully one should ask who had the time and the reason to plan it." As she left, Miss Marple noted how Mrs. Partridge's tension seemed to grow when the conversation strayed near the idea of planning. It was not the tension of guilt, she thought, but of someone who feared being drawn into a net by association. On her way home, she passed the Harwood cottage. The curtains were drawn in the front parlor, though a faint movement suggested someone inside. She continued without pausing, but her mind turned again to the disturbed earth in the garden and to Mr. Harwood's uneasy manner at the meeting. The next morning brought a small but telling piece of news from Mrs. Harris at the grocer's. "Miss Felton's been seen," she said, leaning closer over the counter. "She was in Much Benham this morning, waiting outside the chemist's. Didn't go in, though, just stood there for a bit and then walked away." "Perhaps she was waiting for someone," Miss Marple suggested. "Maybe. But she looked pale, and she kept glancing over her shoulder." That image stayed with Miss Marple through the day. Fear could make a person careless, and carelessness in the wake of a murder investigation could be dangerous. If Miss Felton was frightened enough to consider leaving the village or to meet someone away from it, then the opportunity for an unguarded word was close at hand. By evening, Miss Marple had settled her plan. The inspector's next gathering would not need to be large. It would need only the right people in the right room, with the right question placed carefully where it could not be ignored. She would speak to Inspector Crail in the morning and suggest that the final conversation be arranged at short notice. For now, she allowed herself a quiet cup of tea at her kitchen table, the steam curling into the lamplight. She knew the quiet would not last. In St. Mary Mead, quiet was never the end of a matter. Only the pause before the last stones were turned and what lay beneath brought into the open. The game of the 3 teacups had begun as a village amusement, and it would end, she felt sure, in a final move that would show exactly who had been playing to win all along. Inspector Crail did not need much persuasion when Miss Marple called at the station the next morning. She laid out her proposal with her usual quiet precision, emphasizing that certain truths emerged only when the right people were made to feel they were on the verge of safety, or exposure. The inspector listened without interruption, his fingers drumming lightly on the blotter before he nodded. "All right," he said. "We'll do it. But it needs to happen quickly, before nerves settle again." And so it was agreed. That very afternoon, the vicarage drawing-room was chosen as the scene. Mrs. Clement was only too pleased to host, for it gave the appearance of a simple, neighborly tea, and her hospitality would ensure that no one suspected a deliberate trap. The guest list was short: Mrs. Partridge, Miss Felton, Mr. Giles, and Mr. Harwood. Miss Marple arrived early to assist with preparations, or so it seemed. In truth, she used the time to note the arrangement of the tea service and the position of each chair. Subtle arrangements, she knew, could matter as much in conversation as they did in a parlor game. By 3:30, all were assembled. Mrs. Clement moved gracefully between the guests, pouring tea into her fine Worcester cups. Inspector Crail stood unobtrusively near the window, hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of polite disinterest. Miss Marple sat in her usual quiet corner, her knitting on her lap, though her eyes were not on her needles. At first, the conversation was innocuous, remarks on the weather, the harvest festival, and the vicar's sermon the previous Sunday. But as the cups were refilled, the inspector cleared his throat. "There's one thing I can't quite put to rest," he said, his voice even. "The poisoned cup. Whoever placed it must have been certain Mrs. Harwood would drink from it. That certainty means prior knowledge, and prior knowledge points us to a small group of people in this very room." A silence followed, thick enough to hear the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Mrs. Partridge straightened. "I've told you before, I didn't poison anyone. No one is accusing you without cause. Crail said mildly. "But we do know the cup was moved twice, once to prepare it and once after Mrs. Harwood's death." Miss Marple spoke then, her tone soft, as if thinking aloud. "I've always thought it curious that the cup returned to my doorstep was clean enough to handle, yet still had a residue inside, almost as if the person who left it wanted it to be found and examined, but not too soon." Mr. Giles shifted in his chair. "That could mean anything." "It could," Miss Marple agreed. "Or it could mean the second person, the one who moved it after, wished to cast suspicion on another. Such an act requires both knowledge of the cup's significance and access to it after the fate, and that, I think, narrows the possibilities very considerably." Miss Felton's spoon clinked against her saucer, her hand unsteady. "If you're implying," she began, but stopped as Crail turned his gaze on her. "You had reason to fear Mrs. Harwood's tongue," the inspector said. "You've admitted as much, and you told Mr. Giles about the game in advance. That knowledge was enough for someone to act on." Miss Felton shook her head. "I didn't tell him to do anything." "Perhaps not," Miss Marple said, "but information has a way of traveling with its own momentum. Mr. Giles, you are well placed to hear and pass on such things, quietly without drawing notice." All eyes turned to the postmaster. He swallowed, the movement visible in his throat. "I might have mentioned it to someone, but I didn't poison her." "And yet," Crail said, "you met Mr. Harwood after the first meeting here. We have a witness. What was discussed?" Harwood's voice was sharp. "It was private." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, deliberately. "I dare say it was. Perhaps about what might be found in a garden bed if one looked closely, or about ensuring that nothing of the sort was found at all." Harwood's face tightened. "You're guessing." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "I've been watching. The soil in your garden was disturbed twice, not once. The first time to take what you needed. The second time to hide the evidence, or perhaps to remove any remaining trace after you realized the police might look." The inspector stepped forward slightly. "You deny it?" For a moment, no one spoke. Then Harwood's gaze flicked toward Mr. Giles, quick but enough to be caught. Giles' eyes widened, and he leaned back as if to distance himself physically from the unspoken admission. Miss Marple laid down her knitting. "It was meant as a warning, wasn't it? Just enough to make her ill, but aconitine is not a thing one can measure by instinct. A little too much, and the line between a warning and a killing vanishes entirely." Miss Felton gave a small, stifled sound. Whether of shock or relief, it was hard to tell. Harwood's shoulders sagged. She was going to ruin us. She threatened to spread lies. About Felton, about me. I thought if she were shaken, she'd stop. I never meant— "But you acted," Crail said, his voice hard now. "You prepared the cup, made sure it would be hers. And when it went further than you intended, you tried to cover your tracks. You roped in Giles to help you dispose of what was left." Giles shook his head quickly. "I didn't know what was in the cup. He just asked me to get rid of it, and I panicked. I thought if I left it for Miss Marple, she'd know what to do." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. "You were not wrong about that, Mr. Giles. But you were wrong to think it would spare you questions." The room was very quiet. Outside, the sound of a cart rattling down the lane seemed far away, belonging to another world entirely. Crail straightened. "Harwood, you'll come with me now. Giles, we'll talk further at the station." As the inspector led them out, Miss Felton remained seated, her eyes on the floor. Miss Marple, rising slowly, touched her shoulder lightly. "You must see now, my dear, that secrets are rarely kept by harming others. They only grow heavier." When the door closed in the vicarage fell into silence. Miss Marple returned to her chair. She picked up her knitting, the needles moving again with steady precision. Another pattern completed, another tangle unraveled. The game of the 3 teacups had been played to its end, and as always, the truth had been poured out as surely as tea from the pot, once the right hands had been at the table.